I stepped into the dimly lit, confined hospital room, immediately sensing the shift in the atmosphere. My heartbeat quickened ever so slightly. A subtle flutter of unease in the pit of my stomach. Though this wasn't my first time assisting a patient, there was something uniquely unsettling about this particular situation. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I had navigated countless scenarios in my nursing career, dealing with everything from routine checkups to urgent life or death emergencies, but no amount of experience had quite prepared me for what I was about to face. Mr. Jacobs, a man in his late 40s, was usually a reserved patient, always coming in for his routine checkups with a quiet, almost withdrawn demeanor. Today, however, there was a tension in the air that seemed to cling to the room. As I approached his bed, I could see that something was different. He shifted uncomfortably beneath the hospital sheets, his movements betraying a nervous energy that wasn't typical of him. "Is everything all right, Mr. Jacobs?" I asked gently, offering a soft, reassuring smile. I wanted to ease his discomfort, to make him feel at ease before the examination began. But as I spoke, my eyes unintentionally fell upon something unusual just beneath his hospital gown. It was clearly visible through the fabric, and I froze for a moment, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. I hadn't expected this. It wasn't something I had ever encountered in my professional life, and the sight of it momentarily rattled me. Heat rushed to my cheeks, but I quickly regained my composure, reminding myself of my role here. I was a nurse, a professional, and this was simply a part of my job. Unexpected things happened in nursing. It was a reality I had come to accept long ago. Yet, even so, the moment felt undeniably awkward, and I felt a wave of embarrassment wash over me. "Let's just get you situated, Mr. Jacobs," I said, attempting to maintain a calm, neutral tone and redirect my attention away from the situation. I moved closer to adjust his gown, but as I did, it slipped further than I intended, revealing much more than I had anticipated. I hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. My thoughts raced as I weighed my options. Should I address it directly? Should I simply step out of the room? Before I could decide, the door to the room suddenly swung open, and another nurse peeked inside, her eyes wide with surprise. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt," she stammered, quickly retreating from the doorway. I was left momentarily stunned by how close she had come to witnessing what had just occurred. After she left, I turned back to Mr. Jacobs, whose face had turned an even deeper shade of red. The discomfort in his expression was palpable, but there was something more there, something that spoke to a deeper layer of embarrassment or perhaps even shame. "I'm really sorry about that," he said, his voice shaky, betraying the unease that he was trying so hard to hide. I did my best to stay calm, offering him a reassuring smile, though my own heart was beginning to race. "It's all right," I replied softly. "Let's just get you ready for your exam." As I turned to gather the necessary supplies, I felt his hand brush lightly against mine. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt of uncertainty through me. Was it an accident? Or was there something more behind it? Was it a silent signal? A message I wasn't sure how to interpret? Before I could dwell on it further, the door swung open once more, this time to reveal the doctor. He entered with his usual confidence, oblivious to the tension that hung thick in the air. He glanced between us, his eyes briefly flicking over the scene without seeming to register the unease that had permeated the room. "Everything okay in here?" he asked. His tone casual. I nodded quickly, eager for him to take over and allow me to leave. I could feel the tension in my chest tighten, and I longed for the moment when I could escape the strange, uncomfortable atmosphere that had settled between Mr. Jacobs and me. Despite my departure, the unease lingered. The look in Mr. Jacobs's eyes stayed with me throughout the rest of my shift, gnawing at my thoughts. What had he meant by that hand brush? And what was behind the disquiet I had sensed in him? Later that day, as I went about my routine tasks, a message flashed across my phone. It was a note from the front desk. Mr. Jacobs had specifically requested me for his next checkup. My stomach churned with anxiety. Why did he want me? Was it simply because I had been there earlier? Or was something else at play? A sudden unease washed over me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pulled into something I wasn't prepared for. The following day, I had no choice but to confront the situation head-on. I re-entered his room, my mind racing with questions and concerns. I tried my best to remain professional, to pretend as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened the day before. But the moment our eyes met, I could sense the difference. There was a new look in his eyes, one that wasn't filled with the nervousness I had seen the day before, but rather something else. Something more self-assured, almost possessive. "I've been thinking about you," he murmured softly, his voice low and intimate. My heart fluttered unexpectedly at his words, a wave of discomfort sweeping through me. I tried to laugh it off, though it came out more nervously than I intended. "Let's focus on your exam, Mr. Jacobs," I said, attempting to steer the conversation back to a professional level. But before I could say another word, the door swung open with startling abruptness. This time, it was Mrs. Jacobs. She entered quickly, her eyes immediately narrowing as she scanned the room, locking onto me with a gaze that could cut through steel. My heart skipped a beat, and I hurriedly excused myself, eager to avoid any further complications. I left the room quickly, my mind racing. What had just happened? Was this the end of it? I tried to focus on my rounds, but the events of the past few hours continued to gnaw at me, leaving me with more questions than answers. Later, while attending to my duties, I received yet another message from the front desk. Mr. Jacobs had specifically requested my assistance again. I hesitated for a moment, my nerves jangling, but I steeled myself. I would maintain professionalism, no matter what. When I entered his room, I found him sitting up in bed, the energy in the room heavy with tension. He looked at me with calm eyes, as though nothing had happened between us. "I'm glad you're here," he said slowly, his voice steady but with an undertone I couldn't quite place. My pulse quickened, but I did my best to remain neutral. "I'm just doing my job, Mr. Jacobs," I replied coolly. For a brief moment, he looked as though he might say something that crossed a line. But before he could, the doctor entered the room, carrying a stack of medical documents. He began speaking about the examination, his presence a welcome interruption. I seized the opportunity to quietly step out of the room, my heart still pounding in my chest. As I walked down the corridor, I couldn't help but wonder what might have happened if the doctor hadn't walked in when he did. The thought of what could have transpired between Mr. Jacobs and me left me feeling uneasy, like I had narrowly avoided a situation that could have escalated in ways I wasn't prepared for. The rest of my shift was clouded by the weight of that nagging feeling, the sense that this wasn't over. By the time I was nearing the hospital exit, eager to leave the events of the day behind me, I was startled to find Mr. Jacobs standing by the door. He stepped toward me, his eyes intense, his presence uncomfortably close. "I just need to talk," he insisted, his voice low, sending a shiver down my spine. My pulse raced, and before I could respond, a colleague called out to me, diverting my attention. Mr. Jacobs glanced at me one last time before abruptly turning and walking away, leaving me standing there, uncertain of what had just transpired. I took a deep breath as I walked down the hallway, my thoughts swirling. What was he trying to say? Why was he acting this way? I had no answers. But one thing was clear, the situation wasn't over yet. The next day, I tried my best to focus on my other patients, deliberately avoiding Mr. Jacobs's room. But as the day wore on, another message came through from the front desk. Mr. Jacobs had requested to see me again. My heart sank. This time, I had to be firm. I was determined to set boundaries, no matter what. Upon entering the room, I immediately noticed Mr. Jacobs sitting near the window, his gaze fixed on something distant, his expression unreadable. The silence in the room felt almost suffocating, as if the very air between us had thickened with unspoken words. For a moment, it was as though time had paused, and the world outside ceased to exist. "I wanted to talk to you," he said, his voice breaking the stillness. His tone was unexpectedly serious, lacking any trace of the usual warmth I had come to expect from him. He didn't even glance in my direction, his attention seemingly absorbed by whatever he saw outside the window. I stood still near the door, hesitant, unsure of how to proceed. The professional boundaries I had maintained over the past few weeks felt fragile in this moment, and I instinctively guarded myself against whatever was about to unfold. "About what happened earlier. I think you understand," he added, his voice quieter now, as he slowly turned his head toward me, his eyes searching mine with an intensity that unsettled me. I swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on me. My professional composure wavered as my mind raced to make sense of the earlier interaction. What had happened between us that was so important? What did he think had transpired? "I'm here to assist with your medical care," I said firmly, my words meant to bring the conversation back to safer territory, a neutral ground. I had no desire to entertain anything that could cross the line between caregiver and patient. Before I could continue, however, the door swung open suddenly, cutting through the tension. Mrs. Jacobs entered, her presence immediate and commanding. She looked between the two of us with a sharp, scrutinizing gaze, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. The air thickened, and the atmosphere became charged with an energy I couldn't ignore. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice edged with suspicion. I instinctively stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest, as the tension between us grew palpable. "I was just leaving," I said quickly, trying to defuse the situation and retreat to a safer space. My words felt hollow in the face of her glaring stare, but I knew there was no other option. I turned to exit, feeling her eyes burning into my back as I moved toward the door. In the hallway, I paused for a moment, my breath shallow as I tried to steady myself. What had just happened? Had Mr. Jacobs been flirting with me in front of his wife? Or had I misinterpreted the situation entirely? I couldn't deny the unsettling feeling that lingered in my chest, gnawing at me. The rest of my shift passed in a blur, each moment thick with the weight of what had occurred. The sounds of the hospital, usually familiar and comforting, seemed muffled, as if I were in a dream. I found it hard to focus, my mind constantly returning to the earlier encounter. As my shift drew to a close, I thought I had finally escaped the tension that had clouded my day. But just as I was about to gather my things and leave, Mrs. Jacobs approached me at the front desk. Her expression was cold, and her presence felt imposing. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low and sharp. There was no question in her tone, only command. The stern look she gave me left no room for argument, and I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I followed her away from the bustling staff, the weight of the impending conversation pressing down on me with every step. Once we were out of earshot, she stopped and crossed her arms in front of her, her eyes narrowing in a way that made me feel as if she were searching for something hidden, something she was determined to uncover. "I know what's been going on with my husband," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper, but filled with accusation. I froze, the blood draining from my face. I had no idea what she was referring to, but the look in her eyes made it clear she was not about to let this go. "That's not true," I began, my voice shaking with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. But before I could elaborate, she cut me off sharply, her words like a whip. "Don't lie to me," she snapped. "I've seen the way he looks at you, the way you respond to him." My mind raced, trying to formulate a response that would make sense of the tangled emotions and misunderstandings. "It's not what you think," I said, my voice steadying as I tried to explain. "I'm just his nurse." Her gaze was unwavering, and her eyes narrowed even further, as though she were looking directly through me. "I'm not naive," she retorted, her voice hardening. "He's changed since you started caring for him. And I know it's because of you." I opened my mouth to protest further, to explain the professional nature of our relationship. But she didn't give me the chance. She leaned closer, her voice low and threatening. "If you think you can come between us, you're mistaken," she warned, her words like a silent promise. "Stay away from my husband." With those final words, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, stunned and speechless. The accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped in a situation I hadn't asked for. The following days were an emotional whirlwind. I tried to avoid Mr. Jacobs as much as possible, but no matter how hard I tried, his words, his eyes, the strange tension between us, lingered in my thoughts. I found myself questioning everything: his intentions, my own reactions, and the increasingly confusing dynamic that had developed between us. It felt as though I were caught in the middle of something I had no control over, a game I never wanted to play. Then, one evening, as I was preparing to leave for the day, I walked into the hallway and saw Mr. Jacobs standing there, waiting for me. My stomach sank, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. I couldn't avoid him anymore, and I felt a sudden sense of inevitability wash over me. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but insistent as he stepped closer. I fought to maintain my composure, trying to suppress the rising panic inside me. "I think it's best if we maintain a professional distance," I said, my voice firm. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew it would not be enough to resolve the tension. His eyes darkened, and there was a flicker of something dangerous in them. "My wife spoke to you, didn't she?" he asked, his voice tinged with anxiety. "Yes, she did," I replied, my heart pounding. "And I think it's best if we both respect her wishes." But instead of agreeing, he smiled, slowly, unsettlingly. "She doesn't know the half of it," he murmured, his voice dropping to a whisper that sent a chill down my spine. Before I could react, he reached out and grabbed my wrist. My breath caught in my throat, and I instinctively pulled away, my pulse racing. "What are you doing?" I demanded, taking a step back, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. He didn't release me. Instead, he smirked, his grip tightening slightly. "You're not going to tell anyone, are you?" he asked, his voice low, almost amused. "We both know how this could play out." I felt a surge of shock and anger at his audacity. Without thinking, I turned and started toward the door, determined to report his behavior. But as I reached for the handle, I froze. Mrs. Jacobs was standing just outside the door, her gaze sharp and unreadable. She had clearly overheard part of the exchange, and I could see the silent tension building between the three of us. She didn't speak, but her eyes shifted back and forth between her husband and me, her expression a mixture of suspicion and something else, something darker. I felt trapped, caught between two forces I couldn't escape. The silence that followed was thick, and for a moment, I wondered if she had known exactly what was going to happen. Had she anticipated this moment? My body ached with confusion and frustration. I knew I needed to remain strong, to stay focused on my role as a professional. But there was something about Mr. Jacobs that I couldn't shake. The way he looked at me, the way he touched me, the way his presence seemed to linger even when he wasn't around, it was all-consuming. I tried to tell myself it was inappropriate, that I should focus only on my duties and avoid any personal entanglements. But the undeniable allure of the forbidden, the dangerous thrill of what might be, wrapped itself around me in ways I couldn't explain. And though I tried to push it aside, there was no escaping the undeniable pull. Mrs. Jacobs hadn't shifted her scrutinizing gaze for even a moment, her expression a mask of unreadable calm. There was a stillness to her, an intensity that seemed to pierce through the air. It was as though she could see right through me, unraveling my every thought and action in the silence between us. The certainty that prickled my skin grew stronger, as if I were standing at the edge of a precipice, unable to decide whether I should fall or retreat. Was she aware of the undercurrent of tension that clung to the room? Was she fully aware of the dynamics at play? Or was she truly as oblivious as she appeared to be? The more I observed her, the less I could tell. Her demeanor suggested she knew exactly what was happening, yet she remained utterly composed. That unnerving duality left me feeling exposed, as if I were trapped in a web I had only just begun to understand. Mr. Jacobs, ever the presence that commanded attention, took a step closer. His approach was deliberate, his voice low and measured, with an undercurrent of confidence that made me instinctively tense. "She won't make a scene. She knows better," he said, his words dripping with certainty. There was something in his tone, something subtly possessive, that urged me to step back, to pull away from the magnetic pull he seemed to have over me. Yet his presence was overwhelming. The way he spoke, the way he carried himself, it was all calculated, exuding an aura of power and control. It ignited a battle within me. A struggle between my rational thoughts and my gut instincts. "This isn't right," I whispered to myself more than to him. As though saying the words aloud could somehow reassure me. But even as the words left my lips, I felt the weight of them, how flimsy and empty they seemed. What was I trying to convince myself of? Without warning, he leaned in even closer. His breath warm against the delicate curve of my neck. His hand brushed lightly against my waist, sending an involuntary shiver racing down my spine. My body, despite every rational warning, responded to his touch in a way I could neither control nor understand. I should have stepped away. I should have distanced myself from this situation before it spiraled any further. Yet, I remained frozen, my limbs betraying the professional demeanor I had spent years cultivating. His hand lingered against my skin. A subtle pressure that felt both intrusive and intoxicating. "This is wrong," I reminded myself, the words echoing louder in my mind. But even as I thought them, a deeper part of me hesitated, confused, enticed, and yet repulsed all at once. Something in this moment was unraveling me, pulling me in, even though I knew I should resist. The tension in the room broke like a sudden storm when Mrs. Jacobs entered. Her calm presence cutting through the charged atmosphere with quiet authority. She moved with purpose, her posture straight and unwavering, as though she had just stepped in from a world where this kind of drama was all too familiar. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil that had just unfolded between her husband and me. Her question was simple, but in the undercurrent of it, I could hear something else, something unspoken. Something that made my heart race faster. I immediately retreated, desperate to regain some semblance of control over my rattled thoughts. "Yes. I was just leaving," I stammered, my voice cracking with uncertainty, as I scrambled to gather my composure. As I glanced back at Mrs. Jacobs, I caught a fleeting look in her eyes. Was it amusement? Or something darker, something more knowing? A flicker of something unspoken passed between us. And I wondered, had she foreseen this moment? Or worse, had she been expecting it all along? Was there a part of her that secretly desired these events to unfold in this exact manner? As I hurriedly collected my things, my mind whirled, trying to make sense of what had just transpired. The encounter with Mr. Jacobs had left me shaken, both physically and emotionally. The attraction I had felt, the confusion, the temptation, lingered in the corners of my mind, refusing to be dismissed. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had come dangerously close to something I could neither understand nor control. What was wrong with me? Why couldn't I simply walk away from this man? This situation? These emotions that were far too complicated. I should have known better. But deep down, I couldn't deny the allure. The danger. The thrill. The forbidden nature of it all. Was I repulsed by it? Or was there something about it that I couldn't let go of? A twisted sense of intrigue kept pulling me back, as if I were standing on the edge of something far bigger than myself. The internal conflict continued to swirl within me, leaving me feeling more and more conflicted with every passing second. The sense of danger was palpable. And yet, it was strangely invigorating. As I turned the corner into the corridor, I found myself confronted by Mrs. Jacobs once again. Her intense expression met my eyes with a quiet resolve. And her voice, though soft, carried an authority that stopped me in my tracks. "We need to talk," she said, the weight of her words sinking into me before I could even think to respond. Reluctantly, I followed her down the hall. My steps slow and uncertain, as though my body knew something my mind hadn't fully grasped yet. She led me into a small, secluded office at the end of the hall, the door clicking shut behind us with a finality that felt both suffocating and freeing at the same time. Once the door was closed, the air between us grew thick with unspoken tension. Mrs. Jacobs turned to face me, her gaze unwavering. "I've seen how he looks at you," she began, her voice calm but laced with something heavier, something darker. "And I know what just happened between you two. But I'm not here to cause you trouble." I stared at her, genuinely puzzled. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, as I tried to make sense of her words. She sighed, her gaze flickering for just a moment before locking with mine. "I know the kind of man my husband is. And I know how he operates. He's a master manipulator. And he wants something from you. Something that's not good." A chill shot through me at her words. "What are you talking about?" She took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing slightly as she spoke again. "Because, you see, I'm not the woman you think I am. Tom has a darker side. I've been watching you. And I know what he's been doing. I can help you understand the truth." The words hit me like a physical blow, leaving me stunned and speechless. "Why would you help me?" I asked, my voice trembling despite myself. Her expression remained steadfast, her tone resolute. "Because I want to expose him. I want to show you who he really is. He's been deceiving both of us." Before I could respond, she reached into her bag and pulled out a thick folder, handing it to me without a word. I opened it slowly, my heart pounding as I saw the photographs and documents inside, things I hadn't expected. Things that painted a different picture of Mr. Jacobs than the one I had believed. "Look at who he really is," Mrs. Jacobs urged, her voice almost a whisper now. "Look at the truth. And then decide if you want any part in this." As I scanned the documents, something inside me clicked. The pieces fell into place, the games, the manipulation, the tension. It was all part of his plan. I had been a pawn in his game, just as she had been. Mrs. Jacobs watched me, her expression unwavering. "This isn't just about you. Or me," she said, her voice tinged with something fierce. "It's about power. And I refuse to be powerless any longer." She reached into her bag again, pulling out a small, innocuous-looking object. "Join me. We can take him down together." In that moment, everything shifted. I realized with a sinking feeling that I had unknowingly stepped into something far bigger than I had ever imagined. The stakes were higher than I had known. And this was only the beginning. Thank you for taking the time to watch my video. If you found the content useful and interesting, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss out on our latest videos. Feel free to share it with your friends and leave your comments below. Thank you so much. And I'll see you in the next video.